I would like to thank the Brennan Center for putting on this terrific conference and for giving me the opportunity to talk to you about this research. About a year ago, I partnered up with the Brennan Center to answer an open question both among legal and economic and scholars and social scientists. The question was, what is the effect of low contribution limits on electoral competition? One group of scholars posits that low contribution limits would benefit incumbents. And with low contribution limits, I mean contribution limits of $500 or below. Another group of scholars thought just the opposite, namely that low contribution limits benefit challengers. This issue became particularly important after the recent Supreme Court decision that Laura just mentioned that invalidated Vermont's contribution limits as being unconstitutionally low. So whether contribution limits are anti-competitive or not, or pro-competitive, is an empirical question. We sought to answer this by looking at data of state assembly general elections in 42 states over a 26-year period from 1980 to 2006. This study has three components. First, I looked at the voting pattern in these races to see if the vote totals were closer in races governed by low contribution limits as compared to races governed by high contribution limits. And here, with high contribution limits, I refer to limits for House Assembly races over $2,000 per individual and over $2,000 per political action committee. The second component of the study looked at fundraising. Here, I considered the fundraising difference between incumbents and challengers to see if low contribution limits have any effect on the amount of money raised by these two candidates, by the challenger and by the incumbent. And finally, the third component was focused on public financing issues. Here, I studied the competitiveness of elections in 2 states in the sample that had public financing available for state assembly races, namely Maine and Minnesota, in order to see if public funding has a pro-competitive effect. So one important background to keep in mind when I tell you some of the numbers is that the incumbency rate for state assembly races hovers around, the incumbency re-election rate hovers about 95% in state assembly races. So, and while some of the numbers I mentioned may seem small, I just like to know they're all what we in the business refer to as statistically significant. Now, controlling for many variables, I found that in the first part of the study, that races that were subject to low contribution limits were much more competitive relative to races that were subject to high limits, that is, those over $2,000. And by more competitive, I mean the following. There were more candidates in the races. There were more races with a viable challenger. There were also more close races and more races where the challenger won. So the lower the limit, the stronger these pro-competitive effects were. For example, I found that in states with races that were governed with individual and PAC contribution limits of $500 or less, challengers have had a 10 percentage point higher chance of being elected than in races with high limits. Conversely, incumbents, of course, had a 10 percentage point increase in losing. The higher the limit, the less close the elections. One other number, perhaps, relative to races with a 2,000 contribution limit, a 500 limit, lowers an incumbent's margin of victory by almost 17 percentage points. In the second part of my study, I found, first of all, as a general matter, that incumbents on average raise 4 times as much money as challengers. But when I measure, again using regression analysis, when I measure the effect of low contribution limits on the fundraising gap, the fundraising gap drops dramatically when these candidates are subject to low contribution limits. States that limit individual contributions to $500 or less, they show a 20 percentage point smaller fundraising gap between incumbents and challengers relative to states with high contribution limits. And in the third part of my study, I considered the effect of Minnesota's partial public financing law and Maine's full public financing system. So when I looked at these states, I found that the winner's margin of victory and the incumbent's margin of victory were about 16 percentage points lower than in states without public financing. And states with public financing have a 4% higher likelihood of having a close election and a 29% higher likelihood that the incumbent faces a viable challenger. So when I compare these public financing results with the findings on low contribution limits, we find that only low individual and PAC contribution limits of $500 and below are as effective as public financing in enhancing the competitiveness of elections.